Thank you for that beautiful music. It's wonderful. So, if you were not here last week, you may not know that we're in the middle of a sermon series called Women Who Move Mountains. Today, as we celebrate United Women in Faith Sunday, we are going to focus on Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. And I chose the characteristic of service. And hopefully by the time I get finished with the sermon, you'll know why I picked that. But first I want to explain why I picked this particular scripture. When I began attending the United Methodist Church in Oshkosh, Nebraska, of course we had announcements like you folks do here, and there was once a month always this meeting of Dorcas Circle. I had absolutely no idea what that was, even what the name Dorcas was. I mean, was it the name of a person? Was it, I had no idea where it came from until I found this passage. And then, that aha moment. Oh, I understand now why there's a Dorcas Circle. And of course, Dorcas Circle was a circle of United Methodist women. We do not know much about Tabitha or Dorcas because there's just not much about her other than this particular passage. But we do know that she served widows, or that she was part of a community of widows. Widows were particularly vulnerable in the ancient Near East. For the most part, employment outside of the home for women was discouraged. In fact, it just wasn't done. So married women had to rely on their husbands for support. Unmarried women either continued to live with their parents or they took to the streets, sometimes doing unsavory work. However, one line of work was respectable enough and suitable at that point in time for women, particularly widows, and that was of a seamstress. Apparently, this is how this group of women we hear of in Joppa supported themselves. They were seamstresses. How many of you sew or have ever sewed or maybe quilt? Or how about just craft in general? It's really cheap, isn't it? No, it's not. Just go into Hobby Lobby or Michael's, go into the fabric section, and I know how to sew. I learned when I was young, and I have made some of my own clothing. But I will tell you that by the time that you buy the pattern, by the time that you buy the fabric, and by the time that you spend the amount of time that is necessary assembling something that is wearable, and you tear out the seams 4 or 5 times because you haven't quite got it right, you might as well have just walked into some store and bought the piece of clothing, because it would have in the long run been, if nothing else, less frustrating. But these women, this was what they did. But where did they get the money? Some biblical commentators have come up with the idea, and I think it's a valid one, that Tabitha not only was someone who helped create clothing. Oh, and by the way, you couldn't just walk into a fabric shop and buy fabric most of the time. It had to come from merchants or traders. Sometimes they even had to make it themselves. A lot of times it was undyed, and so they'd have to dye it. So there was a lot of work that came into this. But it's highly likely that Tabitha was a patron of these widows. So not only did she help create the clothing, but she supported them. If you'll remember, if you were here last Sunday, you would have heard about another group of women who supported the disciples. That was Mary Magdalene and the group that traveled supporting them out of their resources. They were patrons, as is apparently Tabitha. One of the questions that came up in the Wednesday night small group was, why was this woman saved? Why was she picked as the woman to be saved from death? Because it seems like she's just a woman to us. But to these women, she was the woman. She was the woman who helped them, who gave them purpose, who gave them something to do with their lives, who gave them meaning. And she was gone. Again, much like the story last week, where Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, the body is gone, the stone is rolled away, the body is gone. Jesus, she thinks, is dead. The world has ended for her. In this case, the world has ended for a community of women. They don't know how they're going to go on. And some of them may have been young enough that it was going to be a long time that they were going to have to figure out something to do. And none of them wanted to take to the streets because, again, that was their only other choice. This was important to them. They needed Tabitha. We can assume so because when she dies, the disciples, and we don't know who the disciples are either. Another question that came up in the Wednesday night group. Who are those disciples? Where did they come from? Well, a disciple is simply someone who learns and applies that learning in their life. So it could be that these are widows. Very well, could be. But we don't know. All we know is that the disciples send 2 men to seek help. Where did the men come from? Why are they there? If we were to move back 3 chapters in the book of Acts, we would find out why those men are there. Apparently, in the 6th chapter of Acts, there's an issue with the widows not being taken care of. And people come to the disciples, the 11, 12 disciples at that point in time, and say, we got to have somebody who's responsible for this. So they appoint 7 men, at least in Acts 6, 7 men. Now, we don't know 3 chapters later, were there more men that had been appointed in other cities? I think probably so. That makes perfect sense. So these 2 men were probably the men who were appointed to care for, to provide for just kind of the day-to-day safety, and if there was concerns that these men could take it to the disciples. And again, when I'm saying disciples, kind of with a big D. And so they are sent to seek help from Peter. Peter's been in the area. Peter's in Lydda, and he's been performing healings and miracles. Lydda is not very far from Joppa. So these women, they beseech the men, go get Peter, and they go. So one thing I want to mention here is that in Jewish tradition, bodies should be buried within 24 hours. As a little aside, I want to lift up the current disaster in Israel and the Gaza Strip. For the Jewish people, it is not just a tragedy that their loved ones have died. That's a great tragedy, yes. But it's also a tragedy that some of those bodies still are not back with their family, and we're 2 weeks past. This is grievous to them. Coming back to our story here, The people need to do something because in 24 hours from the time of Tabitha's death, she is going to be buried. And they think, okay, we've got this narrow window, let's see if we can do something. So the men go in haste. It's probably about a 4-hour walk from Joppa to Lydda. And then Peter and the two men come back. When Peter comes back, he restores Tabitha to life. Now I want to stop and say something here. This story is, at first blush, and most biblical commentators will focus on the fact that Peter healed Tabitha. And yes, that is a miracle. But we're looking at it from the lens or through the lens of service. And there's a great deal of service going on here. First, Tabitha to the local community, to that community of widows. She is serving them. She is providing for them. And not just for them, but she's also active in the making of clothing. And we know this because the women show them to Peter. Here's how important she is to us. Then we have the men to the widows. They could have refused. The men could have refused. Oh, they're just a bunch of women. They don't need our help. They could have also said, so what that Tabitha's dead? We were sent to care for you and make sure that you had your needs filled, but traveling 4 hours by foot to Lydda, that wasn't in the contract. We're not going to go. Then there is the wider context of Peter's service to that ever-growing Christian movement. He was one of the main disciples of the Christian movement. He is a busy man. He also could have said to the two men, no, she's just a woman from Joppa. I can't go around healing and restoring everyone to life. But he recognizes that this is an urgent need, and he serves this community and gives an example of service to Christian disciples. This is what you're supposed to do. I chose this passage for United Women in Faith Sunday because although they are not solely a service organization, United Women in Faith serve. So I want to give a little history. UWF's 150-year legacy began with a few bold, brass, sassy women determined to change the world for the better. In 1869, Clementina Butler and Lois Parker, wives of missionary to India, made a plea to a group of 8 women in Boston about the spiritual and physical needs of poor women in India. Women were not allowed to be treated by male doctors, and so women were dying. Something had to be done. So these 2 women who were serving, or whose husbands were serving as missionaries, got a hold of 8 women, and 8 women moved a mountain. What would become a lasting legacy of showing up and getting things done? Attendees of that meeting started to work. They called another meeting. Sometimes meetings are good, folks, of more women. They wrote a constitution. And in short order, they organized the Methodist Women's Foreign Missionary Society. It was to help get female doctors into the area where male doctors could not treat women. It was also to help educate the women or the girls because schooling for girls was non-existent at the time. In November of 1869, this newly formed organization raised funds. You know, we always got to raise funds because you can't do much work if you don't have the money to do it. They raised funds. and they sent educator Isabella Thoburn and Dr. Clara Swain to India. The institutions, a women's college and women's hospital, started by these two ladies, still serve the people of India today. During this same era, when so many women were being held down by prejudice and circumstances, other bold and brassy, spunky women moved to answer the call to stand up for better lives for women and for a better world in general. These include, and there's quite a list, the Missionary Association of the United Brethren Church, which was formed in 1875. The Women's Home Missionary Society, one was founded in 1880, the other in 1890. The Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the Methodist Protestant Church, which was formed in 1879. And the Women's Missionary Society and the Evangelical Association in 1884. And I'm going to cough, excuse me. These groups became powerful, independent organizations. They sent hundreds of women missionary doctors, nurses, and educators all over the world and supported countless mission work in the United States and international projects. They advocated for justice for children, for women, and disenfranchised communities. Now, I want to remind us, for those of us who were here last week, remember, women are suspect when they give testimony, when they begin to do something. These women didn't care. They saw a need and they spoke out against it. They didn't just speak out against it, but they did something about it. Joined together by a common faith and a single-minded purpose, the Ladies' Aid Societies. How many of you have heard of the Ladies' Aid Societies? When I came into the United Methodist Church in the 90s, the women, the elder stateswomen of the church were still talking about the Ladies' Aid Societies. They started in the early 1900s. The Methodist Episcopal Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church merged in 1968 to become the United Methodist Church. 4 years later, the women organizations of these respective churches, all that I have talked about, combined into one, the United Methodist Women. In 2022, United Methodist Women became United Women in Faith. According to the press release, quote, "The changes are designed to address the different needs and life stages of current members and new women and expand options for membership and engagement. The new name also aims to welcome current members whose local churches may choose to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, as well as women from other faith traditions who want to join. The change occurred because United Methodist women wanted to become more inclusive." And what I have found is the United Methodist women, and I'm going to use that because that is pertinent to what I'm talking about, they seem to always be ahead of the curve. They put out a book on the Green Church back in the early 2000s on how churches could become more green. And in fact, and I mean, like more energy efficient. And in fact, there's a certification that churches can get if you follow this kind of criteria. They are always on the front lines of dealing with issues of injustice. I cannot be a United Methodist woman or a United Woman in Faith because I'm an ordained elder. I can't hold membership there. But my heart is with this organization because UWF does great work. The mission, however, even though the name has changed and quite frankly does not roll off our tongue very easily, it has remained the same, which is, quote, to seek to connect and nurture women through Christian spiritual formation, leadership development, creative fellowship, and education so they can inspire, influence, and impact local and global communities. United Women in Faith support partners that provide direct services to women, children, youth, and families in neighborhoods around our country. Internationally, we support partners empowering women, children, and youth with education and economic development. Further, members of UWF at home and abroad advocate for a more just world to improve life for women, children, and youth. Those are the three most important issues of UWF: women, children, and youth. On the local level, UWF are the people who get things done. I don't know how it is in First United Methodist Church of Lincoln, Nebraska, but what I know serving different churches throughout my years of ministry is if you want something done, you go to the women of United Methodist Church or United Women in Faith, because they are movers and shakers. Now, some of the women are getting to an age where they don't move and they don't shake quite as fast, but they're still there, and they still provide vitality to a church that might otherwise be really in the death throes. So we celebrate UWF Sunday by honoring the work it does in local communities and around the world. But unfortunately, I have discovered that in many of the churches I served, that UWF is the only organization within the church that's doing such work, and that is not biblical. The Hebrew Bible admonishes us to care for the widow and the orphan and the alien in our midst. The book of James states boldly, faith without works is dead. Jesus in Matthew 25 says, as you have done to the least of these, you have done them to me. And in our gospel reading today, John 13, we hear, so if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet as well. For I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. As Christians, we are called to service, period. So as is my custom, I want to ask some questions so that you can ruminate over the course of the next week. Number one, how can we as individuals serve in our church? That was our topic in our youth group this morning. How can we serve? What can we do? And I always find it amazing, and I'm not particularly picking on that particular youth group, but just in general, as if you ask people how can you serve the church, they can't come up with anything. But we just had a recognition and an award service, and who was brought up to the front of the church? The person who makes sure that the pews are straightened up and that the pew pockets have got everything that they need in the pocket. Someone who lights the candles, someone who hands out bulletins, the person who is the gardener. And I thought that was so wonderful, especially since just last week we heard about Mary thinking Jesus was the gardener. Other ways, right here around this table, right here on this chancel, sharing musical gifts and graces that bless us. And the church just went through church council, charge conference. And in anticipation of those conferences, some of you got phone calls, didn't you? Can you serve as chair of finance committee? Can you serve as trustee? Can you serve? We need people to serve. Because otherwise, there's no church. When I first started attending church, and I didn't grow up in the church, when I first started attending the church, I guess I thought there were church fairies that came and brought the communion elements and filled the communion chalices and changed the paraments and did things with flowers. I never thought about who it was behind the scenes who were doing that. Yeah, the pastor is up here every day, most of the time, every Sunday, but I couldn't make a church work if there weren't people helping. And I mentioned this last week, I'm going to mention it again. I am so thankful that this church has people who come up and do the opening prayer, who do the community prayer, who read, because that was not how other churches that I served were. You are all serving the church by pitching in. But more so, how can the church serve the community in which it lies? The widows of Joppa were not just making clothing for each other, because that would just be silly. They didn't have closets and closets and closets into which they could put clothes that they could not wear. They were making them for the greater community. They were serving the greater community. I know we have a wonderful ministry called the Blessing Box, and there's probably other ministries that I don't yet know about. But I wonder if there's some type of a collaborative partnership that could develop that was mutually beneficial to the church and the community. I don't know what that would look like, and maybe there's already conversations about what something like that might look like. But we are not an island. We are here to serve. More so, how can the church building be used to serve Northeast Lincoln? This church is just like many, many, many other United Methodist churches. You have way more space than you can use. What are you going to do with it? Are you just going to let it fall? And this is not directed towards this particular church. I've directed this question to every church that I've served. What are you going to do with the rest of this space? There's always collaborations that can happen. Just some as an example that I know of through my ministry. One church had the Boy Scouts meet there. Some churches have AA meetings. Some churches will have blood banks. Some will have health screenings. Churches have plenty of room to serve the community. And the last question I want to leave you with is, what ministry or mission in our local community has been left undone because no one is willing to provide the service? Because no one yet has stepped up and said, I will do that. And sometimes it's an idea that's been floating around within the individual's head, but they've not gained the courage to broach it. If you have an idea that you think would be helpful to this church and to the community, bring it to the church leadership. Because, my friends, the worst thing they can do is tell you no, and the best thing they can do is say, that's a fabulous idea, let's get to it. And so as you go forth this week, I hope that you will look at the story of Tabitha and see how important that she was to that community because of the service she provided. My hope is that when I lay on my deathbed, that someone will run to Peter and say, save her. I don't know that that's going to happen. But wouldn't that be wonderful if that's what happened when we laid on our deathbed? Is that our death our leaving this earthly world was going to cause so much pain that people would say, I wish she'd stay. I wish he'd stay because of the service they provide. And I want to end with this thought. I didn't think about it this morning in the first service, but we had this conversation in youth group this morning. Genesis 12:2 says something like, be a blessing and you will be blessed. Now notice how that starts. It's not be blessed so you can be a blessing. It's be a blessing so you can be blessed. Because most of the time when we serve, as long as it's serving from our heart and through the urging of the Holy Spirit, we are blessed in return. We may not get accolades all the time, but we know we've made a difference. Go forth and make a difference through your service. Thanks be to God. Amen.